We all know that Jesus calls us as his followers to go out into the world and be a faithful presence that embodies his kingdom to a dark and dying world. But what happens when the world around us is trying to do the same thing in reverse? And that's the tension we're going to see in Jesus in Galilee, Part 4, the Pagans of the Decapolis. Hello friends, if we are standing on top of Mount Arbel, which you can see in this picture here, and we look straight east across the Sea of Galilee, we are going to encounter this region known as the Decapolis. And today we're going to jump into this group of people, the Gentile pagans of the Decapolis. Now, when Brad set up this series in the first episode, he talked about why it was that Jesus relocated from Nazareth to Capernaum. And Matthew makes mention that he left Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. And so this region, the Decapolis, is this massive area to the south and east of the Sea of Galilee. And there is a spot here where it juts west across the Jordan River, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But if you were to look at almost like a political map of the Sea of Galilee, you get something like this, that all of this area in the green is Galilee, and it's ruled by Herod Antipas. All of this in the yellow is Gaulonitis, and it is ruled by Herod Philip. And then the red here is where you see the Decapolis. And you get these big Decapolis cities on the shoreline that we're going to talk about. And there are some further in, Gerasa, one across west of the Jordan River, Decapolis, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And this is a picture of what Decapolis looks like today. But Decapolis just is a combination of these two Greek words. First, deca, which means 10, and polis, which means city. So it's a league of 10 cities. Now, these cities were organized in the 3rd and 4th century BC, and you need to think in terms of like the Big Ten Conference, because it swelled way beyond 10 cities. In fact, we don't even really know for sure how many cities were eventually on it, what all those cities were. You can find some historical lists here and there. But it starts out as these 10 cities that are planted in the heart of the land of Israel to be almost like a Greek colony, a microcosm and a showcase of Hellenism and Greek culture in the land of Israel. And by the time Jesus is on the scene, Rome is in charge, and Rome has kept this Decapolis area intact because Rome has some vested interest in the Decapolis being what the Decapolis was. And Brad mentioned this in the first episode of this series, that wherever the Romans are, that's where the money is. So the Romans want this area of the Decapolis here because of these lucrative trade routes that are running through this land bridge of Israel. So you've got the International Coastal Highway, and then you've got the Transjordanian Highway. And the easiest place to connect those two is right here through the region of the Decapolis, so that the Romans could then siphon all of that wealth out toward the port cities and back towards Rome. But the Romans also used the Decapolis area as a buffer region against their enemies on the Eastern Empire. So you had the Parthians to the east, and Rome never actually conquers the Parthians, but then they had the Nabateans to the south, which in 106 AD, the Romans will finally conquer. But at the time of Jesus, that's not the case. So the Decapolis is sort of a buffer area. But more than anything else, in the Roman mind, these Decapolis cities, which have a ton of autonomy, who report to the Roman governor in Damascus, they exist to be a showcase and a trumpet for Greek, Roman, and Hellenistic values and culture. And it's that cultural influence of the Decapolis that we need to understand as we look at Jesus' connection to the Decapolis and what our connection to the Decapolis in our lives is going to look like. So biblical scholar Paul Wright defines Hellenism this way. Hellenism was an all-encompassing way of life, a package of thought and behavior that defined one's view of oneself, others, and the world of the divine. Now, Greek influence and culture had been moving east for centuries, but it wasn't until Alexander the Great that it really accelerated and accelerated fast. And that's because Alexander is born at a time when Greek culture and influence are really flowering. I mean, Alexander learned from Aristotle. It was just a moment in history when the Greeks felt that they had really refined their thinking, that they had a better way of seeing the world than the rest of the world, and they almost felt this sense of responsibility, a kind of cultural imperialism, that they needed to go share that better view of the world with everyone. In fact, you see this come through in this quote from Isocrates, where he says, "Our city, Athens, has so much surpassed the rest of mankind in thought and in speech that her students have become the teachers of the rest of the world." And that's exactly what Alexander the Great does. And so as he sweeps through and ends up conquering one of the largest empires the world has ever known, he embeds this Hellenistic culture everywhere he goes, and he does it in a number of ways. First is language. Everywhere he goes, he brings the Greek language in much the same way that English in our world is the language of commerce. Greek became the primary language in the ancient world. And this connection between language and culture is so important. In fact, there's this lovely quote by a novelist, Khaled Hosseini. He says, "If culture was a house, then language was the key to the front door and to all the rooms inside." So if you have a language that is naming what we talk about and how we talk about it, then you're already making a massive influence on the people around you. And so language was one of the primary ways Alexander the Great did this. Religion, everywhere Alexander conquered, he was bringing temples. He was building temples. He was bringing Greek religion. He was always kind of savvy about incorporating elements of the local religious cultures that he encountered into the Greek religion. And so you begin to see this kind of mixing, this religious syncretism all throughout his empire. But he does this also through education. So everywhere he goes, he's going to build gymnasia. And gymnasia were the place where young men, they would do physical activity, but primarily they are there to learn from philosophers, poets, astronomers, mathematicians. I mean, it's just going to become the place where they learn that Greek worldview, that refined way of seeing and understanding themselves, others, and the world of the divine. Alexander is going to take athletics everywhere he goes. He's going to build stadiums. He's going to build hippodromes. He's going to embed this idea of the individual and competition. And actually, it's in these stadiums where these athletes who are competing in the nude begin to represent the ideal image of the human body. That is cultural, that is Hellenism to the core. And then, of course, wherever Alexander goes, it's entertainment. There are going to be Greek theaters, because if you want to introduce new ideas to a culture, you do it through story. You do it through comedy. If you can get people to laugh at it, you can get them to consider it. If you can get them to consider it, then you might be able to get them to adopt it. And this is our world. Eugene Peterson describes this Greek culture this way: the Greeks were not content with conquering militarily. They were crusaders for a way of life marked by intelligence and beauty and pleasure. They were aggressive, persistent, passionate, persuasive, and highly successful. So one of the first things we need to understand about the mentality of these pagans of the Decapolis is that they are cultural crusaders. Now, I want you to think that you are a young Jewish boy or girl, and all you know from the other side of the Sea of Galilee is these little towns like Chorazin or these little fishing villages like Bethsaida, and then you follow Jesus across the sea and you encounter this mountaintop town called Hippos that sits right on the Sea of Galilee. And every night from your childhood, you have looked out across the water and you have seen these big, beautiful city lights lighting up the night sky. And you come here and you just see all of Roman culture, Hellenism on full display. I mean, it would have been absolutely awe-inspiring. And in fact, when Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount uses this expression, "You're the light of the world, a city on a hill cannot be hidden," his listeners would have immediately thought of Hippos, because that's exactly what it was. Or if you were to travel further inland to the town of Gerasa, I mean, look at these streets. These are big, wide, broad streets with colonnaded sides of the street where shops are. I mean, this is nothing like the little towns you know. And again, when Jesus makes mention in Matthew 7, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it." Well, his followers are going to be thinking about these Decapolis cities. And this is another picture of Gerasa to just give you an idea of the sheer size and scale of this city. And again, Scytopolis with all kinds of stuff going on here. So it's really critical to understand that for followers of Jesus who came across the sea to encounter this, it is massive. It is stunning. It's like a kid from the country that is seeing New York City for the first time. And it is culture that is deeply alluring and profoundly sensual. I mean, this is wealth on a scale that people had never seen before. This is power in a way that their minds could barely begin to comprehend. I mean, we're talking technology. You've got entertainment, shops, bathhouses, hippodromes, temples. People come here, they have leisure time to pursue all of this stuff. I mean, you've got enough money that you don't have to work all the time. I mean, that would have blown their minds. And then, of course, it's just a place of unrestrained sexuality. In other words, if you could imagine it, it was on offer in the Decapolis. Now, here's the catch about Alexander the Great and Hellenism. Alexander himself didn't force people to take on Hellenism. And I think that's because he knew something deeper about the human psyche that Neil Postman, in his incredible book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, pointed out. And in this book, Neil Postman says, if you want to control a people, don't inflict pain or fear on them. Inflict pleasure. Because if you create a culture that caters to their desires, people will willingly enslave themselves to that culture. And that, my friends, is the essence of the Decapolis. It is deeply alluring and it is profoundly sensual. Now, the Gospels use an interesting phrase to describe the moments when Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee to come over to the Decapolis. And you see this phrase show up in Matthew 8, Mark 4, and Luke 8:27. And it's this Greek phrase, ta peron, and it just means the other side. And we hear that phrase and we think, oh, of course, he got in a boat and he went to the other side of the shore. But it actually has a more technical sense, and there are two dimensions to it. So for Jesus to go ta peron, to the other side, is for him, once again, to cross from one political district to another. So he may not go directly across to the other shore. He might just be going kitty corner. But when you encounter that phrase, it means he's left one political district and he's entering a new political district. The other dimension of that phrase, ta peron, the other side, is it gets used metaphorically, almost in the same way that we hear the phrase the dark side. So when Jesus tells this parable of the prodigal son, he tells this story of this young boy who takes his inheritance and he goes to a far country. And there he squanders his wealth with wild living, and then he gets hungry and he goes and he hires himself out to a citizen of that country who sends him out to feed the pigs. Well, where is there pig farming? That's in the Decapolis. So Jesus' listeners hear this, they're like, gosh, a far country, wild living, pigs, that is the Decapolis. It is the far country. It's far from God. It's the dark side. In fact, a group of scholars who wrote this fantastic book, A Visual Guide to Gospel Events, simply say, going to the other side was nothing less than crossing enemy lines into the realm of Satan. I mean, that is booming language to describe what Jesus is doing. But here's the thing. Jesus goes there. Jesus goes to the other side, and we see that in a couple of these stories. He comes to this place of Gergesa, and here's what you can see of Gergesa today. But it's at Gergesa, and this is another picture not far from there, along the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, where he encounters a demon-possessed man who's living among the tombs. And you can see in this picture, there are some ancient tombs. And he's going to cast out this demon named Legion, and the demons are going to go into this herd of pigs. So we know we're in the Decapolis because we have pig farming again. And then the pigs are going to run down a steep hill into the sea. And it seems like this is the most likely spot for that to have taken place. And we don't have the time to go into all of the contextual details of that story. In fact, Brad did that in episode 59, The Bread of Life, part 3, and we'll link to that in the show notes if you want to go check that out. But what I want you to see is just this really simple detail that after Jesus heals this demon-possessed man in the Decapolis, we read this: as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. He wants to be with Jesus. But Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. And 3 chapters later, we find Jesus back in the Decapolis, where he's been teaching in the wilderness for 3 days. And there are 4,000 people from the Decapolis there. Well, how did they get there? But more than likely, it's because this man came back and told about what Jesus did. And these people, hungry for the same thing, come and find Jesus, and they're willing to be with him for 3 days. And Jesus is going to recreate this miracle of the multiplication of bread. And he's already fed 5,000 over on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now he's in the Decapolis. He's going to feed these 4,000 Gentiles. But I just think that what you can see in these 2 stories is, yes, this may be a pagan Gentile group of cultural crusaders, but these are cultural crusaders who were spiritually starving. I think sometimes we forget that there is a poverty of wealth, that you can have it all. You can have things, you can have money, you can have the good life, and yet there's still something missing deep in your bones. And they see that in Jesus and they want it. And of course, the question for those of us who follow Jesus to the other side, to the dark places of our world, is that as we do that, who's influencing who? I mean, this is part of the heartbreaking story of the people of Israel, is that God raises up for himself a nation of people and says, I want you to go out into all the world and you're going to be my representatives. And they do, and their hearts are led astray by the very cultures that they've been sent to transform. So there is no doubt that, like Jesus said, we are called to be salt and light in a dark and decaying world. But we've also got to be mindful that as we go about that, influence is always a 2-way street. As you seek to influence others for the kingdom, there's always this exchange going on, and there is a kingdom of darkness that is also seeking to influence you in return. And so my thought for us as we ponder what does it look like to follow Jesus into the Decapolis is, we have to steward our influence. Where is Jesus inviting you to go to the other side, to places of darkness, so that you can be a light, you can be a kingdom influence? But be mindful as you do that to ask this question: are you also stewarding your influences? Are you aware of the way that you are being influenced in those very cultures that you are meaning to transform? Because my friends, it is something very different to absorb your influences or to choose them. So are you curating and interrogating the ways the cultures that you inhabit are influencing you? Are you wisely discerning the way the cultures you inhabit are influencing you for better or for worse? Well, friends, there you have it. That is the pagans of the Decapolis. These are people who are cultural crusaders, but who are spiritually starving for the kingdom that's on offer in Jesus. And as we go into the world to be that life-giving presence, we've got to be aware of the two-way street that influence is. So as you go and become salt and light in a dark and decaying world this week, my prayer for you is that you will walk out this text well in your life.